Nietzsche. You know that Nietzsche was the philosopher who announced the death of God.
Nietzsche is often remembered as the philosopher who announced that God is dead. Jordan Peterson, one of today's most widely discussed public intellectuals, frequently cites Nietzsche's warnings about what this death meant. For Nietzsche, this wasn't a victory cry for atheism but a profound cultural crisis, the collapse of the Judeo-Christian moral framework that had shaped societies for thousands of years and taken deep psychological root in human beings. To make sense of Nietzsche's concern, it helps to understand how Peterson frames it in his Maps of Meaning lectures. Peterson frequently reads from Nietzsche to demonstrate that the proclamation God is dead was never meant as mockery. Nietzsche believed that once the old religious foundations were gone, humanity would be left exposed, morally unanchored, potentially violent, and desperate for new certainties. He imagined the modern world standing guilty over the corpse of its own sacred history, now forced to face the burden of creating meaning without divine guidance. Another well-known moment appears in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, where Zarathustra leaves a saint in the forest, quietly realizing that the saint still clings to the old God while Zarathustra brings a message the saint cannot understand. Nietzsche saw clearly that abandoning religion wouldn't automatically produce stronger, freer people. Instead, the absence of shared values could open a void. Still, despite these anxieties, Nietzsche never suggested returning to traditional religious morality. He regarded that system as already exhausted. Peterson often emphasizes this tension when discussing Nietzsche's critique of Judeo-Christian tradition. Nietzsche predicted that once truth became the supreme value, as he believed Christianity itself had insisted, it would eventually undermine the very doctrines that promoted it. In Peterson's words, it was as if Western culture used its own commitment to truth to cut off the branch it was sitting on.
A major part of Nietzsche's frustration with Christianity was its focus on the afterlife. He believed this emphasis weakened human engagement with the actual world, which is already filled with enough suffering to require active effort, not passive anticipation of heaven. Even compassion, Nietzsche thought, could become a force that dissolves vitality. When a society's value structure collapses, as he feared would happen, positive emotion evaporates, but negative emotion remains. People lose meaning but not despair. That void, he believed, drives individuals toward extremist ideologies offering rigid certainty, however destructive. Peterson interprets Nietzsche as an early prophet of the modern spiritual crisis, without the old moral structures. People either fall into nihilism or embrace totalitarian ideology. His own work blends Nietzsche's concerns with the insights of Carl Jung and the moral dramas of Dostoevsky, especially Dostoevsky's belief that moral truth is not just something we argue about but something we enact in life. Dostoevsky created characters who embodied the strongest arguments against his own views and then showed how living morally, even when intellectually defeated, still triumphs. Nietzsche, for his part, warned that cutting down the old religious tree of Western civilization would leave society oscillating between meaninglessness and ideological possession. He expected this crisis to intensify in the 20th century. And history largely bore out his fears. Peterson agrees that Nietzsche saw this coming. A world without shared transcendent values becomes vulnerable to radical political systems promising order. Yet Nietzsche's response to this crisis was not to resurrect old beliefs but to push for a radical transformation of values. He called this the revaluation of all values, a deep reconsideration of what humans take to be good, admirable, or life-enhancing. The envisioned end point of this transformation was the Ubermensch, the overman, a figure who embodies self-overcoming and creates new values. In Zarathustra, Nietzsche described humanity as a rope over an abyss, suspended between animal instinct and the possibility of the overman. Nietzsche also distinguished between master morality and slave morality. Master morality affirms life, strength, creativity, and the willingness to shape one's world. Slave morality arises from resentment, teaching people to see strength as evil and weakness as virtue. Nietzsche believed Christianity grew out of this psychology of resentment, turning the afterlife into an escape from earthly suffering and condemning worldly vitality. Despite his criticisms, Nietzsche did not reject life. He insisted that authentic values must affirm existence, including suffering, loss, and destruction, as integral parts of what it means to live fully. Rather than seeking paradise elsewhere, he urged people to embrace the eternal return, the idea that the best possible afterlife is the willingness to relive one's life endlessly. Peterson admires Nietzsche's genius and density of thought. He describes Nietzsche as a writer of almost unparalleled intellectual concentration, someone who could condense entire philosophies into a single sentence. Reading Nietzsche, Peterson argues, allows ordinary thinkers to benefit from an extraordinarily rare intelligence. Peterson also insists that Nietzsche's philosophy was ultimately life-affirming, not nihilistic, despite the fact that Nietzsche himself spent much of his life in poor health. His collapse into madness, Peterson believes, was due to physical illness, not to philosophical despair. Nietzsche was trying to build a foundation strong enough to support life after the collapse of traditional religion, a task Peterson sees continued by Jung, who sought symbolic and psychological structures to replace the old metaphysical ones. In one Q&A session, Peterson reflected on what he would ask Nietzsche if he could. Nietzsche maintained that modern people must create their own values once the old religious framework disappears. But the psychoanalysts, Freud and especially Jung, identified a major problem with this idea: the self is not a unified, consciously controlled entity. Humans are internally divided, driven by competing motives and emotional subpersonalities. Because of this complexity, we cannot simply invent values out of sheer willpower. Peterson's question to Nietzsche would therefore be, how can human beings create their own values when the psyche is not under unified, conscious control, when we are full of contradictions, instincts, and motives that we did not choose? If we were truly capable of shaping our own beliefs at will, we could remove guilt, rearrange our morality, or redesign our emotional responses like programs. But we cannot. Much of who we are is not chosen, it is inherited, unconscious, and resistant to deliberate control. This realization, Peterson says, was one of the ideas that shook him deeply when he first studied psychology, that the human mind is far more crowded and conflicted than our conscious self admits. This complexity complicates Nietzsche's vision of self-created values, raising the question of how much control we truly have over who we become.